Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing Dictionary of Literary Symbols by Michael Ferber, using symbolism to add to our stories. Basically the idea here is that one of the ways that we can add depth and nuance to our story is actually inserting different things into not only the description, but also how things are said and different ways that we are talking about our story. Literary symbols. A symbol is anything that hints at something else, usually something abstract, such as an idea or belief. A literary symbol is an object, person, situation, or action that has a literal meaning in the story but suggests or represents some other meanings. Basically, the idea here is that there was an old picture that was circulated years ago where it was posing the question from the perspective of a student that said their teacher had said that why were the curtains blue in this particular story. Now, the student, not understanding what's going on, is frustrated because they see that as just representing that the curtains were blue. But in reality is if the author is telling the story in a very concise and trimmed down way, the curtains being mentioned at all should have a meaning, something that we should be, as readers, be picking up on, or something that's not necessarily supposed to be picked up on as a realized concept, but sort of a subtle type of subconscious hint of what's going on. This is sort of the same thing with Chekhov's gun. Chekhov's gun is that you don't put a firearm in a scene unless it's going to be used shortly thereafter. Just like with that, why would you put curtains, specifically a colored set of curtains, if you're not in there to do something specifically? Now, there are cases where we're talking about world building or setting the scene, and that is important. But when we're talking about certain types of stories, we want to make sure that we're layering as much meaning as possible into what the reader is reading so that they get as much out of it as possible. This is where literary symbols come into play, ways that we can add a subconscious feel to what we're looking to do. These are all ways that we can add to our story that I believe has been lost over the course of time. A lot of what we read today, particularly when we're talking about movies, is that there's very little hints at something deeper. I had mentioned in a previous video talking about in the movie Jurassic Park, where they have the character of Dr. Grant take two female sides of a seatbelt and tie them together. This is referencing, which is stated later on, the idea that life finds a way, that two females were able to produce an outcome that wasn't expected. So let's get into it. The first one I wanted to go into is water. Water is one of those versatile objects that we see every day that we kind of glance over. But water is one of those things that we fail to realize that there are so many applications, not just in what's going on in the story, but also how it could relate to a deeper meaning. If we look throughout our history, certain aspects of water have a massive part in how things are being played out, particularly when we're talking about rebirth. When we're talking about a Judeo-Christian perspective, the idea of water as being, particularly when we're talking about baptism on fire, water baptisms, these are different ways that we're talking about a rebirth. This is not just the idea of a rebirth in the form of a baptism is complete submersion in the water and to come back out. This is played out in different ways throughout our literary history, but also religious history that has seeped into our culture. One of the ways that we can use this, and this is used in the movie Shawshank Redemption, is at the end when the main character escapes from the prison. What ends up happening is that he actually stands in the rain. Rain is that same idea that the water's rushing over him and washing away what was the prison. He is now free. He is reborn. These are some of the ways that we can use this in our storytelling to indicate that a change has taken place. This person is new, that this person isn't the person that they were before. So when we're talking about a rebirth, and we're talking about water specifically, you could have a character go through a tough time, and as they're going through a tough time, they are experiencing rain, where rain falls on them, and at the end of it, they are a different person. This is a way of symbolizing that particular set of rebirthing. And this is something that we can not just use in when we're talking about characters and other things, but we could also be talking about healing. Water has rejuvenative properties. When we're talking about somebody who's going through a desert, when they find water, it is refreshing to them. When somebody is going through a drought period in their life, drinking water is a way that we can show that they are recovering from those maladies, recovering from those wilderness experiences that they have been going over and through for the past however long the story is taking place. These are ways that we are allowing the story, the imagery of the story, to partake in how we're telling our stories. These are just some of the ways that we can use water to tell our stories. Inversely, we can also be discussing suffering. For instance, one of the ways that we can show this is that there is a tempest, there is a thing that's going on, a change in the events that are taking place. For instance, if we go back to the imagery of Jurassic Park, they have a cup of water that is being shaken when the T-Rex is walking around. This is shown multiple times to indicate that there is a disturbance in the area. These are ways that we can show that things are not supposed to be the way that they are, and the water's indicating that there is a disturbance of what's going on, particularly when we're talking about storms that happen on the seas. We could be indicating that waters are rough. You have a character that's standing on a cliffside, and when they're staring out, they can see a storm coming at them. That could be an indication that events that are about to take place, that they are going to go through a time of suffering. The storm is one of those things that we can use to indicate and foreshadow how the events are about to take place. We are hinting, which is another word for foreshadowing, of the events that are going to take place. And these are some of the ways that we can tell this to our readers before they actually see it. This way that they can, if they are familiar with the work that you are writing, particularly if you're reading multiple times, this will allow the reader to get more out of it for multiple readings. Bees. These are one of those other things that we can use in our stories to help illustrate a feel to a scene. One of the ways that this can happen is say you have a city. You can say that there's a buzz or a lack of buzz. So what you're doing is you're comparing a known quantity, bees, to a city, and you're comparing it so that the readers have an understanding of the type of feel and energy of that particular city. When we're talking about bees, we're talking about a hive. We're talking about a community in its pure sense. Now, bees can have issues. Now, when things aren't working the way they are, there is a discordance in a hive. Just like that, we can show in our cities that there's a discordance in how the events and how the community is being affected. So these are different ways that we can show without telling that things are wrong. Mountains. The mountain is one of those majestic things. You have a person going over the mountain. This indicates not just that they are climbing something, but this can indicate that they are overcoming something. But at the end of the day, the overcoming is just a factor of what the event is actually taking place. there's a term called the mountaintop experience, where you have achieved something, where you have struggled and developed and overcome a struggle so that you can achieve the goal that you're looking to achieve. There are going to be high times in lives that they have to overcome. One of the ways that we can indicate this in our story is you have a character growing and overcoming by literally walking up a mountain. Now, walking up a mountain or climbing a mountain is a struggle for anybody, even the best of us. Even the most experienced climbers are going to have a struggle on, at some point, some mountains, which is why mountains like Everest and K2 are extremely dangerous. People attempt to climb them even though they are extremely hazardous and fairly likely to actually kill those who that attempt it. But this is a struggle that everybody goes through in every point of their lives. They have a mountain that they have to overcome, which is why we're talking about the term mountain out of a molehill. When we're talking about a mountain out of a molehill, we're talking about somebody that is conflating a big event or a big struggle with a small one. Or there's like you are making a mountain out of the molehill, you are saying that this is a big issue, but in reality it's not. What is this saying about the character that is doing this? These are some of the ways that we can add struggle to what our characters are going through by literally having them, and metaphorically having them, go through a climbing mountain experience. Now, inversely, the valley experience is something where we're talking about depression. This can refer to, there's a Proverbs in the Bible where it says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. A valley is an extremely dangerous area for travelers. Why is this the case? Because typically it is the easiest path. One of the books I read years ago was written by a ranger. The adage that they used, easy equals dead. In this case, what they're talking about is that the path of least resistance is always going to be the most fortified, the one that's the most guarded. So when we're talking about a valley, because it is in the lowest point and it is the easiest to access, it is going to be the most dangerous. When things are the most dangerous, we are always going to be at risk. There's always going to be a threat of destruction and death. So when we're talking about a valley experience, we're talking about when you're at most at risk. Typically, valleys tend to have a fair amount of trees as well. Typically, when we're talking about trees, we're also adding a level of danger. So for me, when we're talking about valleys, we're talking about a low area where things begin to congregate. If we look at another similar example, the Dead Sea in Israel is the lowest sea in the world. One of the ways that this is important is that the Dead Sea is the saltiest lake in the world. The reason this is the case is because the Sea of Galilee, which is north of it, flows into the Dead Sea. And because the Dead Sea doesn't have an outlet, all that water just simply evaporates. And over the millennia, what ends up happening is all the salts and contaminants that are in the river and Sea of Galilee, they don't have anywhere to go. So you just have this continual building up of salt, which is why you call it the Dead Sea, because nothing can survive in it. This is the result of the low point in that area. So when we're talking about valley, we're talking about risk. We're talking about unsure experiences. We're talking about uncertainty in the life. This is contrasted to the mountaintop experience, where you have a euphoric mindset, whereas with the valley, it is a danger mindset, where you're talking about struggling and overcoming. The last one I wanted to talk about is winter. Winter is one of those things, those outside perspectives, those outside elements that we can use to indicate that something is wrong in the person's heart. Cold as ice, there's a reason why we use this term when we're talking about somebody who is emotionless or non-connectedness to other people. One of the ways that we can do this is that you have a character who's going through a tough time and they've shut themselves off emotionally from everybody around them. And one of the ways that you can show this is by having them walk through a particularly cold area, but contrasting it or drawing a parallel with what they have going on in their own heart. So, for instance, we could easily say the person was walking down the road. The wind, the cold winter wind, was cutting through their jacket, but the person was unaffected because the coldness of their heart was even colder than the wind that was hitting them. We're showing the consequences of that coldness of heart on the person and how the outside elements of the cold winter is not affecting them because they are so cold and so emotionless. So in the end, I just wanted to talk about how we can use some of these elements in our stories to help us influence how our readers are reading our stories and try to reach them on a subconscious level rather than just trying to be very explicit in the story that we're trying to tell. Our goal isn't necessarily to tell the plot or tell the events that are taking place, but add layers and add flavoring to our stories so that the readers can better understand what's going on and understand how things are being played out. Just want to thank you for everybody that watches. As always, I will be linking any resources I can in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comment section below. Until next time. Bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I